Good afternoon, everyone, from this rather chilling Davos, and welcome to this session on People on the Move, Seeing the Opportunities. I'm Sara Pantuliano, I'm the Chief Executive at ODI, and I'm really pleased that we're having this conversation this afternoon. People have been moving from rural to urban areas and across countries for centuries in search of better opportunities. This is not a new topic, it's not a new discussion, it's not a new reality. And discussions on the benefits of migration for the economy have been prominent for a long time. But these discussions tend to focus on the numbers of people who move. And numbers seem to drive the agenda rather than the economic and the social progress that could, the migration actually allows. And why is that? That's particularly because the host communities very often don't feel the benefits of what migrants add to their societies and to their economy. COVID-19 changed that a little bit. What happened during COVID is we all experienced the importance of migrant workers and how essential they are to our economies and societies. Across the European Union, migrants make 15% of the essential workforce. And in some countries like Germany, they're actually more than 20%. And so in the early days of the pandemic, I think, in Europe, as in the US and in other OECD countries, we felt the extent to which migrant workers really helped save lives, worked on the front line of health services around the world. And later, the shortage of migrant workers brought a number of sectors to standstill, the agricultural sector, in other sectors. But despite this, there is a really deep politicization of immigration that tends to be a big barrier to smart policies, particularly in wealthier countries. And so it's really important to talk about the economic benefits of migration, which they can only be realized if there are the right policies to favor the social and economic integrations of migrants. And this is why it's so critical to have this discussion today, because it is a priority to identify how we can maximize the economic potential of migration through smart policies. And to me, with me to discuss such an important question, I've got two fantastic colleagues. Next to me is Emma Francis. Emma is a climate strategist at the International Refugee Assistance Project in the US. Welcome, Emma. And next to Emma, I have His Royal Highness, Prince Jaime de Bourbon de Parme. Jaime is the climate envoy for the government of the Netherlands, but has also worked in a senior position until recently with the UNHCR. So you're perfectly placed for this discussion. We will open to the audience here in the room for questions a bit further down in the discussion. But for those who are following us online, well, first of all, welcome to the discussion. But please help amplify what you're hearing by tweeting or on any social channel of your preference, and use the hashtag WEF23, please. Jaime, I'll start with you. As I was saying, there's been an increasing polarization around migration in a number of countries, and particularly in Europe, which is pushing towards more restrictive migration policy. At ODI, actually, we've done quite a number of surveys in various European countries that show that the public is not so opposed to migration. It's more the right-wing media and some, politicians that exploit, what comes from right-wing media that create the problems. But it's almost like this a rhetoric that is out of step with public attitudes in most countries when they are, scientifically assessed. So what do you think is the responsibility of political leaders to ensure that this, public opinion is reflected in migration policies? And what are the legal pathways that we can offer migrants?
So I think that there's two sides a leader can take. One is the human approach, and the other one is the practical benefit for society. The human approach is to really realize that people on the move not just because they're opportunists, some are, some are looking for a better life, but many of the people move because they don't have a choice. And specifically refugees, as you mentioned, I work for UNH.R.H, which is the United Nations Refugee Agency, and then you see that the world we thought was moving towards 100 million people forcibly displaced. We thought it was going to be, but actually we reached that number now. So we are 100 million people forcibly displaced, and that's 1 every 78 people on Earth that are forcibly displaced. And forcibly displaced means that you're fleeing conflict or persecution. And the country that should have the responsibility to protect you either cannot anymore because there's war, or doesn't want to protect you, and you have to flee to have a better life. And there's nothing more unnatural than to leave everything you know, all the friends, family, and livelihood that you have, to flee to another country. So it's a human story, and that we should never in numbers forget. And there are numbers, but it's also a reality. Now, 85% of these people fleeing stay either in the country, in other areas, or across the border in the region where they're from, because they have some remnants of family, ethnic cohesion, religion, where they feel safe. 85, and only 15% continue to Europe and the United States, and we call that a refugee crisis. So the majority stays. But if you look then from a climate perspective, if you compare the conflict maps and the climate-sensitive areas in the world, there's an uncanny similarity. I mean, they're the same areas for many parts. That means that they're not only governance fragile, economically fragile, but also climate fragile. And because 85% of the population lives in the same area, if climate degrades, it becomes drier and unlivable, or too wet, or too, any other climate impact that you might have, then those people will have to move again, not because of conflict, but now because it's unlivable. And not just the refugees, but the whole host communities, the people living in that area. So we'll see much more displacement. So just that's the negative side, and that's why we need to focus on conflict and resolving the issues closer to the place, and look at economic opportunities, good governance, but also the climate impact and help with adaptation. So that's the negative side. The positive side is, I mean, the 15% that continue, but also the migrants that come for economic reasons and sometimes have to flee extreme poverty, which is nearly as bad as fleeing conflict if they're really moving because of real necessity. These people come, and we have a massive shortage of labor in Europe. And as you said, 15% of the workforce in average come from migrants. And the whole question is, how do you skill the right people to be a positive benefit to society? We had such shortages in the last year in most countries in Europe, that we're really looking within Europe to have the labor migration, but also from outside into Europe. So then the question is, if there is illegal migration, can you create positive or like legal migration flows? And in 2050, after the so-called refugee crisis, we have pushed to have labor standards, so to have the possibility to match skills with the labor force, and that has taken some effect. And those are the areas and the pathways where they were looking for. And we're also looking at youth that now want to come illegally to see, well, can we give you a 2-year program to skill you actually? And then the question is, can you then enter the labor force or actually return to your country, but with the right skill set?
Interesting. That's in the Netherlands when you say we.
So this is, I think, in the European context. So everything we do is on the European context, and per country you see what other policies you take to be able to absorb this potential or not. But it is very politically very sensitive, even in the Netherlands. So we see the potential, and you said, what should leaders do? In my personal opinion, I think they should show that there is also a need, and those companies and communities that need the skill, that we focus on it. Actually, the Ukraine war has opened up a lot of opportunities. Suddenly we opened up our doors. Suddenly we opened up our labor markets, and we really fast-tracked the possibility of integration. And it was a fantastic show on how things can happen.
Yeah. Interesting, you touched on what the business community could do to really make the case that they need more labor, because the labor shortages have been profound both in Europe and in the US. Amma, why do you think businesses don't push more? I mean, it is in their interest to have sort of more availability of labor that at the moment is paralyzing some businesses. What could they do to push for different migration policies?
Sure, I appreciate that. I agree with a lot of what you're saying. I think that promoting more immigration is smart for a number of reasons. Jaime mentioned the demographic decline in a lot of industrialized countries. We just know it's been a theme here at Davos all week that there is an aging population in Europe, in the US, and Canada, and there just isn't the labor force to be able to support that aging population, which provides an opportunity, right? And just bringing it back to the US and climate in particular, we have in the US a new law promoting the green transition called the Inflation Reduction Act, for example. And that Inflation Reduction Act is asking the US to electrify everything, basically, which is critical to reducing carbon pollution. But the US doesn't have enough electricians to actually make that transition happen. The US needs electricians to actually have the green transition that it wants happen. And that's the case in many industrialized countries. You need that labor force. And so that presents an opportunity for sure. It's smart. I'll give another example of why I think it's smart. If you took 100 million young people from the developing world and you moved them to industrialized countries, the average annual income gain would be $1.4 trillion, which absolutely dwarfs the global welfare gains that could be gotten by reducing restrictions on the flow of goods and the flow of capitals. What that all means to say is we make it really, really hard for people to move across borders, for a workforce to move across borders, and we make it really, really easy for other things like goods to move. It doesn't make any sense. Promoting immigration makes a lot of economic sense, and as Jaime was saying, makes a lot of human sense as well. So I just wanted to bring it back. I think there's a role for business to play in sort of promoting labor pathways, but it's absolutely critical that in promoting these labor pathways, there's also a focus on protecting people's dignity and rights. So one thing we hear about is temporary migration, for example, filling labor shortages through temporary migration, and I'm sure we'll get to that a little bit later. But these labor pathways can't be extractive or exploitative. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make for long-term good outcomes, because what you're doing when you create a temporary labor force that you extract from, you undermine your own labor force, your own unionization of your workforce, and you also create a situation where you have essentially second-class citizens. That's not going to make for a just or dignified response. So I think it's important that temporary labor pathways, for example, lead to permanent residence. You need to be able to make sure that people are able to access situations of security so that they can actually contribute socially and economically to their new countries.
But let me jump on this right away, since we're discussing it. This circular migration with, temporary, if you want, permits, as you say, it needs to have the rights guarantee and safeguards. Yeah. But there is a lot of reluctance to even, go there for this, so if you want, periodic, seasonal, permissions for people to come and work in critical sectors that really have a labor shortage. Mm-hmm. Why is there so much reluctance on the side of politicians to go where business wants it, the public accepts this is a need, and it would be a win-win in so many ways?
I think people are scared. I think climate change is very scary. We have wildfires, heat waves here in Europe. We have wildfires in the US. You have sea level rise in the Pacific Islands. It's scary for humans, I think, the moment we're in, and it's easy to scapegoat migrants and say they're the problem, and what we need to do is build borders, and that will fix it, and then everyone all of a sudden feels very safe, right? Oh, now I'm safe. I don't need to be scared anymore. When that actually is an illusion. I think what's happening is that politicians are selling a lie of security that's built on the idea of making migrants a threat when they're actually not. Migrants are innovative, resilient, contribute so much to the new places that they're in. And so I think part of the work of the business force, the public, is to push back against that illusion that we're being sold, that migrants are the threat. They absolutely are not.
Couldn't agree more. And in fact, Jaime, you were saying how the bulk of this migration happens in, in neighboring countries where, people move usually within the region. And, we have some countries in Africa, in the Middle East, also in parts of Asia, where the numbers are enormous compared to what we get, in Europe. And there is obviously a lot of support from host societies. What can we learn in terms of, the best policies that you have seen, in your career to support, this migration in a way that migrants can truly contribute to the economy?
So we only think, indeed, and the most perception is everybody wants to come to us because we've got the biggest riches, and the only best opportunity they have is be in Europe or the United States or other places, which, yes, for some it's true. I mean, if you can get education, good health care, etc., it's true. But many, many people, which I said 85% of people, rather stay where they are because they feel that they're still close to home, and whenever they could go home because there's peace, they can then return home way easier. So where they are, so instead from Congo, you go to Uganda. From Somalia, you go to Kenya. You're in those countries, and what they've done in these countries, Uganda best, they've said, we don't create refugee camps anymore. We do settlements, so we integrate refugees with local populations. And why does Uganda do that? They said, well, we were refugees once as well, because they also had a war, and had to flee and come back. And then they said, well, let's also integrate them in the workforce, give them land to be able to cultivate. And so they've really started a new program of really integrating refugees in society, because they also have a sense of how you call it, they really level with them. Same in northern Kenya, Kakuma refugee camp. It's not a refugee camp, it's actually a refugee settlement as well, where they get equipment and they can build up their own houses which are more permanent, and also local populations actually poorer than the refugees because they don't receive aid of the United Nations and NGOs. They can actually partake in the economic development happening in these refugee camps. And we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people living together. These are cities that we're building. And so these opportunities are also there for local populations. And there you see that this combination is actually quite positive. And on the labor force in Europe, I've had a couple of utility companies that actually spoke out to me and said exactly what you said on they needed skilled labor, and if it's not available in Europe, they would like it from the outside. And I think reskilling is a wonderful thing. And if you look at high tech, I saw some virtual reality, they call it here the metaverse, virtual reality learning things. You put on one of virtual reality goggles, and you can get a whole learning curve of actually working the mechanics, learning the skills, even in your own language. It can be developed so that you can actually replicate it. So, and that is so much more effective than sitting in a classroom with 100 people and actually listening before you actually do it. This you can integrate and do it much faster. So there's a lot of opportunities on skills, both for your own population to reskill, but also from the outside to be able to deliver the workforce that we need for the energy transition.
It feels like we are at a bit of a particular moment, and especially post-COVID, as I was saying, where we've come to reevaluate the importance of migrants for the workforce, and we can push back on these narratives that thrive on fear, as you said, but it kind of takes a collective effort to push back from businesses, from parts of civil society, and from responsible leadership amongst politicians, make sure that these narratives don't prevail.
Yeah, I might want to respond to that. I mean, the fear bit. Those who really fear, those who are in danger, they fear and they flee. They come with us with fear and they're looking for comfort. And we fear them? And these are fearful people. How weak are we that we fear people that are fearful for others? And should they fear us again in response? What a strange situation. If I run to my neighbor and I say, I'm fearful because something happened in my home, I hope they don't close the door and say, I'm scared of you. I hope they open up and say, why are you scared of? Can we help you? So it's a strange situation, and it's a perverse policy to demonize people that are incredibly vulnerable and are just trying to contribute to society. And those really want to go back. Migrants that have integrated are so incredibly thankful. Look at Sara. She fled Italy and went to the UK, is running one of the best research institutes in the world. Your skill set was very appreciated in the UK. They could have found someone else, but they found you. So there is a lot of possibility. Many of us are migrants. I mean, I've been working in Geneva as a Dutchman. It feels very normal, international work, but that's also migration. It's also skill sharing. So I would say,
couldn't agree more with
don't demonize it. It's not only the weak, it's everybody is on the move from time to time in their lives.
Amma, do you want to add anything before I open to the audience?
Yeah, I really loved that example and that metaphor of knocking on your neighbor's door and really hoping that they wouldn't respond with fear. I think the problem is that we don't see each other as neighbors necessarily. And so when we have countries that are industrialized, for example, they don't necessarily see people from the developing world as neighbors. And that needs to shift because we are in a global community, right? Climate change is an issue. I'm a climate change expert. And climate change is an issue that affects all of us, no matter where we are. And I really loved what you were saying about reframing who exactly is a migrant. Migration is a very natural thing. Humans have been migrating for centuries, really, and many of us move. The truth is that it's very difficult for some people to move and easier for others to move, and so that's something to rebalance.
And that's the real injustice. Let me open to the audience and see if there is any question for Amma and Jaime. Please, there's a mic there.
Yeah,
to say who you are and your affiliation.
Thank you. No, Efren Galanda worked for the forum on working precisely more on the humanitarian agenda. My question is a bit provocative in a way, but how can you, I mean, the problem is I can hear that both panelists here are very pro-migration or pro-legal migration, let's put it this way, but there are still existing social barriers that prevents migration to happen, and we need to face it. We need to face the reality out of it. And how can we, let's say, prioritize the skills instead of language barriers, social barriers, and how can we bring somehow the expertise that many developing countries that are facing much more migration than European does, for instance. How can it be possible to bring these examples in the table of policymakers, and what does it mean leadership in this space? I coming back to the first question that Sara had. What does it mean migration political leadership in this moment of fragmentation? Thank you.
Thanks. Any other question? No. So, who wants to go first?
I can start. So I think that I appreciate the question, and I think you're picking up on some very important points, and I just want to pull on one thread. You mentioned social barriers and the importance of investing in skilling up workers so that they can move from place to place. And just breaking that down for the audience, I assume you mean we need to make sure that workers have the appropriate skills so that they're desirable to the places that they're migrating to. They can contribute economically. I think that's great and important. And from a climate perspective, it makes sure that people can migrate before disaster strikes rather than after. So I think creating safe pathways for people to get across borders is a really critical response to the climate crisis. And I think that investment ahead of time makes for better outcomes. Planned migration makes for better outcomes than unplanned migration. But that migration of skilled workers leaves behind unskilled workers. It leaves behind people who cannot work, people with disabilities, in some countries women. And so it's really important that we pair these safe migration pathways with also humanitarian relief and initiatives, so we're not leaving anyone behind. I wanted to make that really clear.
Yeah, and skill development is not just, again, in our markets in the West, it's also in the markets where they're actually living, so to really contribute to the local economic development so that they become more resilient and less likely to need to move and find other lives because they're finding it where they are. So I think let's keep on focusing on the whole spectrum where migrants are and support them. I wouldn't say I would be pro-migration or anti-migration. I'm just pro-opportunity, both from a humanitarian perspective and pro-opportunity from an economic perspective. I think that's a better way of looking at it and looking at it with nuance going forward. I think the private sector that is actually benefiting, they can speak out more towards the politicians to explain what they need. We've seen that in Turkey. Turkey had a lot of migrants. Actually, it's one of the countries that absorbs most migrants or refugees in this sense in the world. And what it did is first it didn't give the right to work, but then the private sector said we need a lot of people in the garment industry and other industries. We just don't have the workforce. And then they opened up and they noticed there was a massive positive economic benefit of employing all those people that came from Syria and other countries into their economy. So these kind of voices of the private sector, they convince the politicians there was benefit and this can be shared more. And the companies themselves, not only communicating to the politicians, they also have their own social media, their own networks for other business. So they can be communication partners in this as well.
Yeah, so definitely we need to push for the business leadership, but I think it's also important that, some politicians find the courage to sort of voice that migration makes economic sense, because all the evidence, all the research says that very clearly, whether it's because you get a more diverse workforce that enriches, what a particular economy can produce, or because, can attract diverse talent, brings, different skills that are different from the local workforce.
May I ask you a question?
Sure.
So this latest research that you've done on the opinion of the general public on migration now, how did it change in the last, say, 5 years?
Actually, we're seeing a more positive trend more recently, with the public starting to reassess attitude or change attitudes towards migrants and become more favorable. And we've just done some surveys in Ireland, in Poland, in Germany. They all prove that. In some countries, like Sweden, is going the other way, but in the majority of European countries, it's actually becoming more positive. And we do think that the pandemic has actually contributed to sort of underline, to stress the importance that, migrants play in our economies, because we've all seen them in the front line of the response, whether in hospitals as nurses or in the care economy, and then of course, also to provide essential labor in the agricultural sector, in other sectors. So the public has started to rethink the narrative around migration. Of course, this is, we've known for a long time from research that attitudes about migrations are quite stable, in the sense that there is 25% of the public that is very opposed to it, 25% is quite positive about it, and then there is the anxious middle, as has been defined, of about 50%, and those are the ones that swing. And so now this wing is, moving a bit more positive, but, aggressive right-wing media can push it the other way. And that's why we need to find a way to fight, the rhetoric of what is essentially quite a well-coordinated, structured and well-resourced set of narratives from right-wing media and politicians.
Well, I would contradict that. I wouldn't fight it. It's just bringing nuance to the middle that has to decide, to show what is real and what is not, because there are negative and there's positive elements, and that needs to be, the polarization needs to be replaced with facts.
Yeah. We need to close. I see, signs at the back. I just want to ask you one last question. Next January, another Davos in cold January. The Maeve move has been unsuccessful, sadly. But what is the one tangible policy change you'd like to see?
I would like to see more humanitarian visas for climate migrants. I think it's really important to make sure that people can move in advance of disaster rather than after, and I think we just need governments to actually do that, implement that.
Great. Jaime?
For me, it's more about the implementation of existing policy, which enables legal pathways to really match the skills that need it, and those are out there much better. Well,
thank you so much, Jaime, because you've been so clear also in some of the tangible things that we can do. I hope our online audience and our colleagues here in the room can reflect on some of the key takeaways from today, and join the efforts to really make sure that we can develop more conducive, more appropriate, more legal pathways for migrants, so that they can come in and reach economies wherever they choose to move to. Thank you very much, and have a good rest of the day.